Hey, welcome to the Thinking Podcast. This is your host, Geoffrey Wu, and I'm super excited to have Michael A. Wood Jr. join us today for this week's conversation. And if you out there have been under a rock, you guys might have noticed that there's a lot of conversation, discussion around institutionalized police systems that are impacting, especially our minority populations, especially the Black community. As you know, Black Lives Matter. All these different discussions are some of the most important discussions that we're having today. And I think Michael has one of the most interesting perspectives on this space. His background, which I'll let him dive into, includes 11 years experience in the Baltimore Police Department, serving as a sergeant in some of the most sort of highly regarded units in the police department, as well as being a 4-year veteran of the Marine Corps. I want to welcome Michael onto the show today.
Well, thanks for having me. We don't do any little golf claps or anything like that. Just go right into it.
Yeah.
Okay. So,
yeah.
So I'll awkwardly just transition right into going into it. So thanks for having me. And I understand the background that a lot of people focus on is that I came through the Marine Corps and I came through the police department in a ghetto environment, low economic neighborhoods. But that's not really what separates. What separates is that I'm primarily a scholar and a scientist, and I was trying to learn educational endeavors and trying to learn how systems work and advance my degrees while I was in the police department. And I was seeing you can't possibly succeed in this system. We have to totally re-envision what we're even talking about, what policing is.
100%. Yeah, that's something that I think is interesting, where you're working on finishing a PhD in management studies. And that's something that we at Nootrobox think a lot about, the systems aspect of improving the human experience. And I think a lot of what you're talking about these days is the system level improvements on policing systems and other institutional systems that govern our country today. And I think that's where it's, more impactful than, hey, let's focus on one specific, what we like to call N=1 sort of case studies, right? The more impactful challenges are at the systemic level.
Well, it's even more than that, Jeff. We can't do that kind of work because it doesn't actually even exist in the literature. So it's not even whether we can look at the system and we can follow it through. It's not there. Criminal justice has become like a religion and an ideology. So that system is what we have to explain. And that system right now, when you see how it carries it out, let's look at how it goes, because it's a mayor or an elected politician along with their city council, and they will tell you that they're going to hunt for a police chief. They find that police chief, and then they instill the police chief who they says that they're going to police you in a manner that they want you to be policed, or in a way which they've been convinced is the way that you should be policed. So this, no matter what, involves a small select amount of people telling the recipient of the service how they will be serviced and what services they will get, and on top of it, how much they will pay for those services.
Right.
So that service now is a few select amount of people telling you what you will get. And when they say now what you will get is they think you're going to fight crime, right? So crime is a symptom. And so what they're telling the cops is an event takes place, and that's a crime. So go and investigate that crime. But what they investigate is the details of that crime. And they build a case to put that person into a prison cell and take them off of the streets. So you have them off of the street. And now the detective goes on and waits for the next robbery to take place to investigate the details of that crime and then to put that person into a prison cell. So what that does is now that person goes into a prison cell. But the problem with our prison cells is that they create the problems that actually caused the crime to begin with. So
Right.
they exacerbated the marginalization, the lack of resources, the inability to get meaningful employment. They exacerbate all these things and then release an individual back out onto the street. And now that individual back onto the street has all these things that are going to add up. They commit another crime. And so now the police will again investigate the details of that crime and try to put that person back into a system which will empirically make them a higher propensity to offend when they get out.
Right. Super high recidivation rates, right? It's like a very
Right.
bad negative, feedback cycle.
Right. So now the mayor, to make it worse, the next mayor will come in and say, we need to stamp down crime and we need to do it fast because they have a 4-year agenda. So in their 4-year agenda, you can get crime numbers to be lowered from an authoritarian perspective. So crime was super low during the Nazi regime. It's like that when you're a tyrant, right?
Right.
So so the crime can be stuffed down by shoving these people into prison cells and by putting them into this cycle because they're off the streets for that moment there. They've been kept away from society for that moment. And now the mayor can get lower numbers and they get out of office. The next mayor comes
It
in and now
spikes.
crime is spiked and
Right.
they say, we need to stamp down crime quickly. How do we do this? And then you're now seeing the fruits of that militarization and that escalation. The current system only has one potential end because if you keep escalating the way you respond with force, while you're creating the need to respond for force, you just have nothing but an Orwellian future of tanks on our streets telling our citizens when and where they can go and surveilling them 24/7. This is the exact opposite of what we're supposed to be doing in America. So
Yeah.
we cannot function under this system.
That's an interesting picture of what, the path we're going down under. I mean, I think what you're from a biological explanation, right? Like it's very much we're treating the symptoms, right? Like the street level crime is a symptom of the root cause, which is, hey, there's some actual, institutional, which is like you see this sort of feedback loops and the spikes get heavier and heavier, right? Because you're putting people through the system. These people come out, they can't get gainful employment. They have to resort to crime again. They get put back through the system, and each of these waves gets, I guess, spikier and spikier. And because the politicians are on short-term sort of 4-year terms or sort of like the quarterly short term in a corporate sense, like the short term optimization issues, then you're really punting the ball further and further down the line where at some point it's unsustainable and shit goes down, right?
Right, and I think we're getting to that unsustainable point. I think the age of technology has brought that more into our light, and maybe was a catalyst to that event. But this is that escalation that's growing. So
Right.
you hit on the main problem there, which is they're not focusing on the causes of crime. So this model that we're talking about actually existing, they would have no purpose to actually achieve the goal of stopping crime because if they achieve the goal, they would defeat their entire purpose.
Right.
So what operating system and human expression is going to carry out in a way which ends in its own destruction? I mean, this is the opposite of evolution and the opposite of everything we know how things can operate in any type of environment. So as they focus on these symptoms, no one investigated what the causes were and how to get to those causes to figure out what they are.
Right.
So then you're getting into how the model actually has to look.
Yeah, I think that brings up an interesting point where I noticed in one of your different, conversations that you actually think that the drug war is one of those root causes where we're basically criminalizing what are not. I mean, just stepping even a step backwards, like the fact that we're just segregating different compounds, which aren't even truly based on science, where if you look at alcohol as damaging to a person and to society, it's a lot more dangerous than, for example, marijuana or other compounds with potentially therapeutic uses. And it's interesting where, the FDA has sort of segregated out, chemicals that are scheduled, chemicals that are, generally regarded as safe, chemicals that are research chemicals. And now for the criminalized compounds, we're really going after them and basically creating a black market, a system where it's inherently criminal and drawing uh, a lot of youth, primarily minority youth, into the system, and then again feeding this sort of negative feedback cycle. So curious to hear you sort of explore further your ideas around the drug war and how it's one of the root causes here.
Well, it's not a causation of crime. It's like a contributor to. I don't know how I would cause that. It's more an enabler of the causes.
Okay.
Because like even what you said there it paints a bad idea in our society, where you said primarily minority drug use, and that's completely untrue. The vast majority of people that carry drugs, transport drugs, and use drugs are white people, and not even as a matter of percentages and ratio of the population. Literally, white people have a higher percentage of carrying drugs on
Interesting.
their person, and they have they're better drug dealers too. What makes the difference there is that white drug dealers have resources in America. So a white drug dealer drives a beat up Honda Civic and carries a book bag around, looks like a college student, and drives to his friend's house because he has gas and insurance, he has a place to go, he has access to roads. So the white drug dealer actually has resources. That's one of the reasons why they don't get caught as much. The black dealer in a ghetto type community you're going to think of, who's been redlined, who through generational trauma and oppression has hardly any resources available whatsoever. So their drug dealing involves where they can walk and where they can go to. So they're localized, they're obvious, and that's another reason, because they don't have the resources. So the lack of resources are the causation of the crime, and the drug war just pushes those things more in. So when you were also talking about how somebody ends up to jail and there's these factors, it's not even like there's these factors that go in, or there's like one thing happens. To end up in that situation, it's like a car crash. You have to have multiple things that are wrong happen at the same exact time.
100%.
So it's a multitude of failures that lead to the catastrophic collapse of a societal failure of taking the liberty away from a human being and putting them into a cell. So the drug war enables all that those factors to come together in a dramatic fashion, and it's expressed in the areas where we already have our deep implicit policy legal biases throughout time, for a country that's rooted in slavery and thinking it's better, and pushing white supremacy, colonizing, committing genocide. So that's where policing comes from and has evolved. So when you have something like the drug war, which is a crime against non, there's no victim, right? So you're trying to regulate against inanimate objects, or something where there is no victim, like whether it's drugs or it's prostitution. These are consensual adult agreements that people know that they're getting into. There's Caesar Beccaria from the 1700s in Italy is saying how doing things like that break down the societal structure of any civilization. So these things have been long known to be destroyers of the very fabric of society. And we have the biggest one going on right now to exacerbate and push out all of our implicit biases, where we don't see what's happening in a multitude of angles that are coming in. One of those is like, so we don't think about things like the drug war, with the crack disparity. A lot of people know that crack, what they think of as a black drug, would it has a much higher percentage,
Than powder
much higher,
cocaine, right?
right, sentences than cocaine. But the actual reason behind that was because they were targeting mid-level dealers, and mid-level dealers dealt in a certain amount, and that certain amount in the crack dealing was one level, and in coke dealing was another level, because again, your dealers don't have resources. So a mid-level drug dealer of crack doesn't have as much money to buy in the same level of bulks as a white drug dealer in coke does, who's higher up in coke dealing. That's why, and so we don't think about how that ends up playing out on the streets. And so that's like our big problem is we can think to ourselves, well, drugs are bad. We should fight against drugs. We don't want kids using drugs. So we better do everything we can to keep the hands out of drugs out of their hands. But we don't turn to research and science that says actually the more available the drugs are, the less likely the kids use them. So while that may seem counterintuitive, cannabis usage in Colorado has plummeted among juveniles. DUIs have gone down dramatically. The use of Medicare has saved over $100 million because the older generation has been turning to cannabis for their pain instead of for OxyContin. So you don't have as many overdose from the OxyContin coming off the street and leading to people overdosing that we hear so much about. So there's all these things that come in which end up fighting a war on people because you can't fight a war on inanimate objects. So the people with no resources and implicit biases get multiple factors coming in which lead to that propensity for car crashes that send them to jail because that's our society's answer in this system. And it's counterintuitive to have empathy and to make the drugs available and regulate it. We say, oh my gosh, you can't do that. But we have the evidence in front of us. Like Coors and Bush aren't fighting one another over alcohol territory like the most violent period in American history, which was alcohol prohibition. So the second most violent period in American history is during narcotics prohibition. You can't, I mean, narcotics actually were legal. Bear sold heroin in the United States on counters, and it's not like you had an epidemic of overdosing back when it was legal.
Yeah, I mean, Coca-Cola was made of coca leaves.
Right.
Yeah.
And just recently they found like tens of millions of dollars in a coca factory, I think over in Paris or something like that, in the back where they left a whole warehouse full of cocaine still sitting there because it used to be in the soda.
Right.
So you can see how these things, I mean, we actually have the evidence and we know how systems should work. So it's painful to watch people continually do things we know are wrong and systems we know will fail over and over and over again in policing and criminal justice.
Yeah, I mean, I think there's 2 points that, riffing off of what you just said. I think one, from just a pure biochemistry perspective, like, yeah, again, these are just the universe of compounds. It's like silly to me that like, hey, some have these effects we're going to penalize incredibly harshly, and some are like, yeah, Anheuser-Busch. You get Super Bowl ads with alcohol, or you get, all these glamorization of tobacco use. And for other compounds, hey, you are going to the lockup, or you're a bad person for, dabbling in these compounds. And then second, I think the interesting point around how different populations are judged on the compounds that they use. I think there's a recent Jay-Z short film about talking about how the street level folks who are dealing marijuana are being locked up, and now you see in Silicon Valley and other in Colorado, Washington, entrepreneurs, wealthy, primarily white entrepreneurs, from top tier corporate backgrounds like a Microsoft, et cetera, are making multi-million-dollar businesses with marijuana, on-demand marijuana, and all these different services. It's almost morbidly funny how that, like, the people that are doing it at such a small scale are getting locked up, and people that are doing it at a massive scale are becoming celebrated entrepreneurs.
Well, I mean, so if the system is what I say it is, then that is the expected result. So we shouldn't be surprised by that at all. The drug war, when it becomes a war on people, becomes another tool for white supremacy in America. So it will gather all the profits and the proceeds among the elite group that will continue to carry out that, and leave it away from those of our implicit biases, like the marginalized communities that we're already putting our implicit biases upon. So it just makes, like policing in general, because of these interactions, makes it so that the worst in our society. It's like a microcosm. So everything that's wrong gets brought to the surface where we can see it more readily because of the intensity of the exchange. So when you have uh, that war being drawn on people, like you then break down police legitimacy because procedural justice is one of the things you need for police legitimacy, and that means everyone being treated fairly in the system. While I don't necessarily agree with that ethically, because that also means that the science also will show that if you punish those white people as hard as you punish the black people, well, then people still see that as procedurally just, and I think that's ridiculous, and that's it's supposed to be the other way around, that we should treat the minority communities like we treat the white communities.
Right. Interesting. Yeah.
So the drug war ends up being in that same mold and carrying out that supremacy. In Maryland, just recently, they did the applications for legalized marijuana, where they were going to do the distributions. And out of tens of thousands of applications, no minority owners were picked, although there were tons of
Wow.
minority. In Colorado, the same thing is occurring where these stores aren't being owned by black owners. They aren't being owned by the marginal and the marginalized. So we're anticipating like $500,000 to even apply for the licensings of these places. So that's why you collect it in a capitalistic and white supremacy society. That's what you're going to collect. So if it's true that we live in a white supremacist and capitalistic society that punishes the poor, continues to grow the elite, and when we live under an oligarchy, well, then this is what exactly it would look like.
Yep.
So we keep getting that reconfirmed.
I think that's interesting, right? Because I think that it's inevitable. It seems like that marijuana will be 100% legalized. I think you see interesting clinical research with ketamine, psilocybin, other hallucinogens as potentially therapeutics for depression, PTSD, MDMA, another example. And I can see that these compounds will follow a similar regulatory path as marijuana, going into therapeutic use and then decriminalized and potentially fully legalized. And I think that
It goes so much more than all these factors that compound in with everything. It's like harm reduction, saving money, lowering crime.
right.
It is all these things that drug war brings in because, like you're saying, with a compound. But when you think about cannabis, it is literally the safest substance on this entire planet.
Right.
The only way you can die from cannabis is if you choke on it.
Yeah,
So
I mean the LD50 rates are like you gotta smoke like, yeah. I was just looking at numbers. You need to have like kilograms of marijuana to even get close to having like a toxic dose. Yeah, it's very, the LD50 rates are super high, absolutely. And I think it's interesting that you brought up that it's like super hard for some of these minority populations without resources to like tap into this growing trend, right? It seems like that the drug war is losing its momentum, but the people that are capturing the profit are the people that are existing players in the ecosystem. Like it's not trickling down to like minority players. And I'm sort of the riff on that. How much do you think of it as a purely a racial basis of discrimination, or is cultural aspects also part of it, right? Because I think that with any person, right, it's you're a bunch of different characteristics. Like your race is one attribute. Your cultural upbringing is another attribute. Curious to hear your thoughts on culture and how it interplays with race. Obviously, culture and race are very correlated, right? Where you're brought up is similar to like, there's a lot of correlation to where you're raised and what your parents were. Curious to hear your thoughts on the culture part.
so I don't buy in that race is a thing. So race is a matter of perception, not of reality. So even to say that it is a thing, it's literally not a thing. So we can't even categorize based upon that. And so even when we talk about culture, like I don't know what that means. So do you mean like hip hop culture? Because if that's the case, like that doesn't happen in other communities that have that culture.
Well, then what do you
So
mean then when we say like white supremacy, right? Like you're when I hear that, it's like, okay, I'm thinking like Caucasian, European folks. So we're already using sort of racial terminology. So just just to help explain all the different terms and how we're using them would be helpful.
Right, totally. But we have to understand that it's a matter of the perception or biases and prejudices of the person that's classifying the race, not of the person that's being classified.
Okay.
So it's like if you took it in computer terms or something, it's like the software being coded to do one thing, but the owner saying that it's coded to do another, and he perceives that it's going to be that ones are zeros and zeros are ones. Well, they're going to come out with the exact wrong response because they're not getting the accurate data to make their decision. So an example of where you can see that in policing ties into exactly what you were saying. So recently, there was a Harvard study that was not gone through peer review that showed that one particular agency didn't show a disparity in their area for shooting minority people, right? So if you have a homogenous society like you do in hypersegregated cities. So the top 21 hypersegregated cities in America are the leading cities of violent crime, environmental poisoning, redlining, all these things that come out through history. So when you end up in cities like Milwaukee, the most hypersegregated city, is you end up having a whole cluster of almost black and poor individuals, and then a whole cluster of white middle class and some poor and a variety going up. So when they're segregated like that, we see police departments almost entirely full of white officers living in those white neighborhoods, coming in, policing the black neighborhoods and shooting black people at this higher percentage. So you see it there clearly. When you get into these cities that don't show it as much, these are cities that aren't as homogenous. So if someone were to look at a picture of me, like where I'm out with no sleeves on or short sleeves or something like that, I'm completely sleeved in tattoos. I have tattoos all over my legs. If I was standing out on a corner of a street with a white beater on in South Central LA, and the cops got a call for a Hispanic individual that just robbed a store with tattoos, they would chase me just as much as they would chase anybody else. I would come across and fit that perception of what the race was that they were going for. So when that cop had that bias in his mind, he would still shoot me with the thinking that I was a Latino male, but the statistic at the end of the day would show that I'm a white male. So it gets all mixed up. Now, when we go to an all-white community that's poor and has a lot of those factors, such as the coal mining villages in West Virginia, you don't see cops just willy-nilly shooting white people. So that implicit bias is being expressed. I don't think it's so much racism. That's why we have to get caught. It's the perception of race and how that interacts with our preconceived biases.
Yeah, I agree with that. I think if we're looking at humans as state machines, as having inputs and outputs in our decision making process, right? If we're inculcated in an institutional or societal bias that, hey, we're put in this spot, as you mentioned, these are the variables. You're in your wife beater, you're in a potentially dangerous neighborhood. There's been a call for someone that might match your profile somewhat. You can see how the output would be to be a lot more aggressive than given a different context where it's like, hey, you're in a West Virginia coal mine and everyone sort of.
Right. So you're isolating your variables, right? So if you isolate your variables down to what you were saying, like geography and the clothing I was wearing and things